Well, what a great privilege it is to be a part of this service this morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bryan, and I'm one of the pastors here. And I have the great privilege to share a sermon series that we're going to look at over the next 3 weeks. For those of you who might be new to our church, I want to warn you in advance that this is not your typical sermon series. We're not doing a book study. We're not necessarily doing a verse study. But we're going to talk kind of as a church. And the reason we're doing this is this congregation is about to take steps of transition, of change. We've entitled the series From Here to There, and in less than 90 days, this church is going to leave this campus, and we're going to go to a new campus. Yeah. And it is a little bit surreal. For those of you who have been a part of this church for almost 30 years of existence, we've talked about this forever. And now the fact that it's going to happen quickly. I mean, it's going to be Thanksgiving, and then it's going to be Christmas, and then we're going to be gone. I mean, we're going to be over there, and it's very exciting, and it's a little bit scary too. I mean, it's really, really close. But so for the next 3 weeks, we're going to kind of talk together. And it's a little bit different to what we normally do, but today, what we want to talk, before we can talk about getting there, we want to talk about how did we get here. So this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of our church and how we've gotten to this place and what God has done to bring us this far. And then next week, we're going to talk about kind of the next steps. How do we go there? And I'm just going to be transparent with you. Next week is going to be a difficult message for many of you because next week, we're going to talk about change. And there's people who just really have a difficult time with change. When we move from this place to that place, there are going to be a lot of good, but there's going to be some difficult change for people. And as much as we're excited to get out of this place, let's be honest, there's going to be some of this that we're going to miss. You say, how's that possible? Because there's something about this place that's just special. On the outside, okay, yes, it's a dump. But man, God's done some amazing things in our life at this dump, you know? So this place is just going to be kind of like an old shoe that's comfortable. It's like those sweatpants you put on Sunday after church when you fall asleep watching the football game. You would never wear them out, but they're like real comfortable when you're in the privacy of your own home. This church kind of has some of that feel. So next week, we're going to talk about some change, and for some of us, it's going to be difficult, but it's good. And then in week 3, over the Thanksgiving weekend, we're going to talk about what's next. We're going to talk about future vision and dream, because here's the great concern for me and the leadership of this church is that when we get to that building, that there'll be a sense of accomplishment, which is good, but there'll be a sense of comfort where we kind of want to kind of just kick back and go, we've arrived, let's just enjoy this. And the desire for us in the heart of the leadership of our church is this, that when we get to that place, that won't be an arriving period, that'll be a starting place for a new beginning of what God wants to do in the history of our church. So when we get there, there's more for us to do. And that's just going to be the beginning of a new season of reaching people for Christ. So that's where we're going to go. So let's talk about today, how did we get here? Now, some of you know this story, and some of you lived through this story, but for the rest of us who weren't a part of Ocean City Worship Center almost 30 years ago, this is kind of the conception of this group. So back in the 1990s, there was a gentleman by the name of Tim Dukes. Now, those of you who are local, I am not, but those of you who are local, you know the name Dukes. Duke Lumber in Delaware is well known, and Tim Dukes is a member of that family. And for years, it was understood that Tim would be a part of the family business, that he would be in the lumber business, that he would do that. But God called him to become a pastor, so he went off to Valley Forge, studied ministry, and became a youth pastor in a town called Farmville, Virginia. And he had been a youth pastor there for a period of time and loved the area, loved what God was doing, had a lot of success as a youth pastor down in Farmville. And one weekend, he was a camp counselor at Assemblies of God camp, and he had a student, a camper, in his group by the name of John Wood. Now, John Wood's dad was a pastor, Bill Wood, who was the overseer or presbyter of the Assemblies of God Eastern Shore. And he met Tim Dukes, and he said, hey, there is a need on the Eastern Shore, the Ocean City area, for a church. a Pentecostal, charismatic, Bible-believing church. He said, would you prayerfully consider one day planting a church in the Ocean City area? And Tim had known this area. He was from Laurel. He had come to the beach here, and he thought, wouldn't it be great to do that one day? And that seed was planted, but he didn't do anything with it. He said for years he would drive to visit his family in Laurel, through this way to go to Farmville, and every time he would drive through this area, he would remember the seeds that were planted by that pastor. But it wasn't until August 1990, he was on vacation, and he was reading a book entitled Critical Masses, and he felt that God spoke to him about starting this church. And he said he walked out to see his wife, and he said, honey, he said, I feel like God has spoken to me. We need to start a church. And she said, I agree. Let's go do it. And they were thinking maybe 2-3 years down the road, but he said, I felt this stirring. He said, I can only say a handful of times that I can honestly say that God spoke to me clearly. He said, but God spoke to me clearly. He said, so weeks later, we went to our pastor. We told him we need to resign. We have to start this church. And he said this to me. He said, it was so important that I knew that I heard God's voice. He said, because numerous times through the 12 and a half years that I pastored the church, I thought about quitting. I thought about leaving. He said, but I went back to that moment. He said, God spoke to me about planting a church, about starting a church. So on Sunday, March 31st, 1991, Easter Sunday, Ocean City Worship Center was launched. And you would have thought that since God spoke to him clearly, that huge success would have followed that church plant. But almost the exact opposite was true. They had a great first launch, and then after that, very few people came to this church. He tells the story. He said for years, the worship center never got beyond 25 people. And he said 20 of those people were my family. He said it was my mom, my dad, my wife, my children. He said nobody was coming to the church. And he was so discouraged and so frustrated that and it was also during a time that some of God had started an initiative called the Decade of Harvest, and that we were going to plant 10,000 churches, and we were going to reach 1 million people for the Lord, and that was abysmal failure, and this church looked like it was going to be abysmal failure. And there was a couple of times during the process that Tim thought to leave. He said one time specifically, the church that he was youth pastor, that pastor had left, and they called him, and they wanted him to be the lead pastor in Farmville. And he said that would have been beautiful. That would have been perfect. He said there was a church in Baltimore that called from a church in Pennsylvania. And he said numerous times he thought, I'm just going to cut and run. I'm just going to leave. But he said I would go back to the fact that God called me, that I knew that God had something special for the Berlin area. He said one time he was so discouraged, he was working part-time. He would work here, and then he would work with his family at Duke's Lumber. He said an associate pastor came into the church and had talked to him about, he said, you're discouraged. He said, you're struggling, aren't you? He's like, no, I'm doing fine. He goes, well, how big is the church? He said, we had 22 Sunday. And for years, they had plugged away. He said, we had 22. Financially, the church was struggling. Just emotionally, Tim was tired, and Tim had prayed. He said, God, you remember the song, Should I Stay or Should I Go Now? That became the theme of Tim's life. Should I stay or should I go? He was praying one day, and he felt God say this to him. He said, Tim, if you leave the church that you birthed, he said, you would be essentially committing spiritual abortion. And he said, and that church will never become anything. And Tim said, I made a commitment. I was going to stay. And this pastor came to him one day, and he's talking with him at Duke's Lumber, and he said, listen, he said, I feel like God has a word for you, and here it is. He said, when you were a youth pastor in Farmville, he said, you were incredibly successful. He said, here's the reason why. He said, you were working, you were flowing under the anointing of your pastor. And that pastor for years had prayed and sowed and plowed and planted seeds, and you walked in and reaped the rewards of those who have gone before. He said, here in Ocean City, he said, it's a brand new work. He said, and you're going to have to be committed, and your church is going to have to be committed to do hard spiritual work. And he said, a light bulb went off. And he said, all of a sudden, our church started to pray. And our church started to believe that God would do something. And he said, we started to do the hard work of intercession. He said, I came to a place where I realized that my heart had to experience transformation. And he said that we were going to make a commitment, that we were going to plow hard soil, and we were going to plant seeds, and we were going to believe God to water to bring a great harvest. And he said it was during that time that a couple concepts came. He said, one, we came up with this philosophy that we were going to be a hospital for a hurting community. He said it was during that time that we realized that we didn't have the bells and whistles and the fancy things that other churches might have to offer. He said what we needed was a presentation of an experience of God, that people would walk into that place and sense God, and that they would experience God like no other place. And we started praying for that. He said it was during that time that we came up with the philosophy, and some of your old schoolers remember, he said we started talking about love, acceptance, and forgiveness. That's the kind of church we wanted to be, that people would walk into this place and they would just feel welcomed here. And he said from there, all of a sudden, things started to change. He said all of a sudden, people started showing up. He said people started coming to know the Lord by the bucket loads. He said, Bryan, you wouldn't imagine. He said, we would do a children's program. Little kids would stand on the platform and sing, Jesus loves me, this I know, and they would do little skits that they knew. And he said, I would stand up afterwards and give an altar call. And he said, people would come to the altars crying and accepting God. And he said, it was just a little children's program. He said, people were getting saved by the bunches, and God started working our youth program, and people were coming from all over the place, and God was bringing just new people to the church, and he said it was awesome. He said, and people started believing that God had something great for this church. And they started sacrificing. So he tells a miracle. He says it was during this season that there was this rub going on. He said the church started to grow, but I was still working part-time at Duke's Lumber, and I was still kind of pastoring the church, and there was this tension that I felt God was telling me there was time to take a step of faith and to leave the family business and just do this. But he said financially the numbers just weren't there. It just wasn't realistic. I had a family. He said I had acquired some debt, and he said I had young children. He said I just didn't know how I was going to do it. And he said I was sitting with my wife one day, and he said I said these words to her. I said, if we could just get $5,000 in our church fund. He said I didn't tell anybody else this. He said I told my, if we could just get $5,000. He said I think that would be enough. That would give us the leverage to just take a step of faith. So he tells a story. One Sunday, the church used to meet across the street where the old Olympia restaurant was, right next door to that. And he said, one Sunday, he said, I got up to speak, and he said, at my podium, he said, the worship team at the time was just notorious for just leaving a mess everywhere. And he said, so I went up to my podium. He said, there's papers there. And he said, someone had left like a Dunkin' Donuts bag on the podium where I was going to speak. And he said, I'm telling you, I'm getting ready to speak. He said, I was so aggravated with this worship team that I just picked up the papers, and I picked up the paper bag, and I placed it on the table behind me, and I spoke that Sunday. And he said, and after the service, I went and I had grabbed the papers, and he said I was about to throw away that paper bag, and he said, but it felt like there was some weight to it. And he said, I opened up that paper bag, and inside of it, catch this, he said, were 50 $100 bills. And he said, with it was a note, and I wrote it down. It said, he said, the Lord needs you, and the time to act is now. He said, I don't even know who that person is. Amen. He said, that's someone that God spoke to somebody's heart, and they were obedient, and they sacrificed. And because of that, I said, I'm going to take a leap of faith. And he said, I quit my job. And he said, and all of a sudden, he said, I put all of my energy in what God was doing here. See, even back then, people were hearing God's voice and they were sacrificing. And because of the sacrifices of people who've gone before us, we sit here today. And that we reap the benefit of what God is doing, what he's about to do. So in the fall of '95, they decided to move to this location. And some of you remember when the church first came here, they met in the very front where our children are currently meeting. And God just started to bless that, and then they went to 2 services there, and then they decided we need to do something. Our church is getting too big. So they looked around, they couldn't find a place to go. But this building right here that we're in, they said we can make that something. So this room right here was a tin roof with a dirt floor with a bunch of boats and like duck boats and stuff in here. And they said, let's make that into our new church. So again, the congregation, they decided this. They said, we're going to take up an offering, and we're going to collect some money, and we're going to come after work, and we're going to close this thing in, and we're going to drywall, and we're going to put a drop ceiling in, and we're going to make this our sanctuary. And people did that. Every single night after work, they would come and they would work in this room, and they would give of their time. And so they came into here, and then the church grew some more, and then eventually they went into 2 services, and God just kept blessing, and it was incredible. So then in January 2000, they said, well, we can't stay here. That was 18 years ago. They said, we can't stay here. And they said, it's time for us to start a capital campaign. We need to raise some money. And we need to go buy a piece of property because we don't own this building here. We've leased this thing for 20 years now. And so they started collecting money. And they started their first capital campaign to buy a piece of property. And sadly, you would think again that God would have blessed that, but almost immediately, as soon as they took a step of faith, that this church really went through some difficult seasons. There was really just an attack of the enemy upon this church, and while they're raising funds to get someplace else, that inside the foundation of this church started to wither, and so the youth pastor left, and the senior pastor left, and this church was just kind of lost for a season of time. Well, it was around that time that Pastor Tim had to make a difficult decision, and he had to decide if he was going to stay or if he was going to have to go, and he felt like God said, it's time for you to go. And he said these words to me. He said, God orders your steps, and God orders your stops. And God told me to stop. And he left. And for a period of about 6 months there, this church was really lost. People were leaving by the bunches. The leadership was unclear, and this church was in trouble. But there was a couple of just great men and some great families who just held it together. When everybody else was leaving, they said, we believe that God has something special for Berlin, and God has something special for Ocean City. And people stuck it out. They stuck it out. I mean, I look around this room, and I see people like Bunkin Sherry Mann, and I see Lori and others. There's other people in our first services, Charles and Andrea Adams back there, and folks who just said, you know what, we're not going anywhere. We believe that God's going to bring the right person at the right time, and they stuck it out. And because of the faithfulness of people like Phil Sigismunzi, Ollie Collins, and Dave Douglas, and Greg Cooper, and some of you don't even know who these names are, but I want you to know that this church exists today because of people like that. That they said, we're going to sacrifice comfort. We're going to sacrifice what we see on the outside because we believe God has something special for the future. And people plugged away, and we're here today because of it. And I want to take a moment, and I want to honor for every single person in this room that you've been a part of this church for 15 years or longer, meaning you were here before I got here. I'm going to ask you to stand. As a church, I want to just thank these people. Would you stand, those individuals? Just go ahead and stand. Let's show our appreciation to them. Well, so it was during this time that God started to speak in my heart. I was a youth pastor in Bowie. We had been there for about 9 years. My wife absolutely loved it. She had prayed that God would bring a close friend, and God had given her a friend. Our daughter had just been born. We just built a house, and she designed. She picked out the colors and the cabinet and the carpet, and I said, hey, I think it's time for us to leave. And she's like, oh, my gosh. She said, Bryan, I'll go anywhere you go, but I don't want to go anywhere. And I remember I went to our leadership. We have overseers, and I sat down with them, and I said, I just feel a stirring. It's time. And this was my plan. I'm just going to be real transparent. My plan was this. From the very beginning, I'm a planner. I said I'm going to be a youth pastor for about 10 years, and then I'm going to go be a high-level senior associate in a large church and learn a large church model. I'm going to do that for about 15 years. About 45 years old, I'm going to go and I'm going to become a lead pastor. I'm going to do that for 20 years. And then at age 65, I'm going to move to Tampa, and I'm going to be an usher at the Yankee spring training facility. I'm going to wipe seats and take tickets and watch the Yankees and live in Tampa. That was my plan. So now God starts to stir, and I go to our leadership, and I share my story, and he said, no. He said, I think you're a lead pastor. I said, I don't think so. I said, I'm 30 years old. My wife's 28. Bethany was in braces. She looked like she was like 16. I said, I don't think any church would take us serious. I mean, we're kids. He said, your wife can sing, you could preach, you guys can do this. I said, if you say so. So he said, matter of fact, I have a church for you guys. Now know this. I was in Bowie, 2 hours from here. I knew this church. I knew the history of this church. I knew the disaster that this church was going through. And I already said I didn't want to come here, and I already had other people tell me that I should stay away from this place. So I sit in this meeting, and he says, I got a perfect church for you. 3 minutes into the conversation, he goes, you should go to Ocean City Worship Center. And I said, nah, we're not really interested in that place. We know about that place. We know it's going through a hard time. We don't want to go. And he said, and I quote, he said, you know what, you're probably right. He said, that's kind of a beachy surfer community. He said, you're too straight-laced. You would never fit in there. I said, I agree completely. And I told this story, but I'll remind you real quickly. We're city people. I grew up outside of the Bronx. My wife is from Pittsburgh, and we weren't looking to go to the country at all. And there was a church. Originally, I wanted to go to a church in Rockville, Maryland. I thought that would be a perfect fit for us. But then this church in New Jersey heard about us. I have no idea how they heard about us, but they wanted us so desperately. They were so aggressive. They were like, we heard about you. We want you guys. You have to come here. And so I investigated the church, and this is what I found. For one, my family's from Connecticut. I'm a huge New York Yankee fan. New Jersey is city, so that works for me. The church was 400 people, and they had $4 million in their general fund. And I thought to myself, thus saith the Lord, New Jersey. It just seemed like it was all lining up. I'm like, that's where I'm supposed to go. I'm 30 years old. Nobody else wants me, but this church with $4 million, 400 people, they want me. And they want me so bad, they want to fly me from an interview from Baltimore to Jersey. I'm like, that's a 3-hour drive. Like, pay for my Wendy's and my tolls. I'll be there tomorrow, you know? And so we're all set to go. We're going to New Jersey. We're going to interview. And then out of nowhere, the associate pastor at the time, his name was Dave Douglas, he calls me. And I knew Dave. I was on staff with his son, Lane, who's a part of our church now. And he said, I'd love for you to come candidate at our church. And I said, I'm not really interested. He said, I know you're not. He said, but here's the deal. He says, our church in the last 6 months have interviewed 6 different guys. And our church is getting weary. He said that the 6th guy we've interviewed right now, they're split. Our leadership is split. And he says, half of them want them, half of them don't. He says, I just want them to know that there's other good guys out there. Would you just come and just talk with our team and just speak on a Sunday? Now, I wish I could say to you that God spoke to me, and I'm going to be so transparent, and you're going to think just the worst of me. But this is what I said to my wife. I said, listen, here's the deal. This church wants us to come. They want us to meet with their board. I said, maybe I'll just encourage their board and give them some direction on what they need to do as far as hiring a pastor. They're going to put us in a hotel in Ocean City for the weekend. I'm going to speak that Sunday morning. They'll probably give me $100 to speak. It'll be a nice getaway weekend. And here's the deal. And it'll be great practice for New Jersey. That's what I told her. I said, well, just go do that. It'll be great practice. And sure enough, we came, and the church met with us on Saturday. We met with the leadership team, and so this is what they said, and this is just a rabbit trail, but bear with me for a second. They said, we've assigned each member of our board to talk about different areas of ministry. So one would talk about kind of your personal life, and one would talk about your philosophy, and they have questions in each of those areas, so we're just going to go around the table. The first guy was a gentleman by the name of Herb Leslie. Some of you may remember Herb. His first question to me, I kid you not, was, why do you want to come to the worship center? And I said to him, if we're completely honest, we don't. And you could feel the energy just leave. It was almost anger. People are like, we're here on a Saturday. Why are we wasting our time? But I'll tell you God's provision and God's design. It was like a first date where there was no facades. I was just me. Because I just could care less. I was just like, we're not interested in coming here, and we're just here to help. And so I was just as real can be. This is what I would be if I was your pastor. This is what you should look for. This is what you need in unity in your leadership and in your church. And so we went out. Charles and Andrea took us to Outback. Really? Took us to Outback that night, and way to wine and dine us. It's Ocean City. You got a million great restaurants. They take us to Outback. They put us up in a great hotel that night, and we wake up the next morning, and my wife says, "What do you think?" And I said, we'll do our best, and we'll see what happens. And there was a guy by the name of Bryan who led worship, and then my wife came up and did a song. And I'm telling you, before God, and some of you were here that day, the second I stepped on that platform, I felt in my heart, I'm the pastor of this church. I just felt it. It just felt so real. I remember getting in the car, driving home, and now I'm nervous because I'm going to tell my wife, we're not going to Jersey. We're going, and she's feeling the same thing. She's so afraid. She's like, I'm going to pop this guy's bubble, but we have no business going in Jersey. And so finally I just said, I think that's it. And she's like, I think that's it too. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I was like, this is going to be a disaster because my wife was going to have to, she was a full-time music minister. We're going to take a pay cut to come here, and she was going to do music, but they weren't going to pay her anything. I'm like, how are we going to pay for this? I'm like, this is going to be a disaster. And then you have this weird thing. You've done a job interview. Like, you can love the situation, but it takes two to tango, right? So you're like, I don't know if they even liked us. I don't know if we did well, and I don't know if that went good. And so Dave Douglas, the associate pastor, called me. He said, we want to do a vote 2 weeks from now. And I said, but here's the thing, Dave. I said, I got this issue in Jersey. Now, forgive the expression, but I think you'll get what I was getting at. I said, Dave, I can't date two girls at the same time. My wife was really thankful to hear that, by the way. And I said, let me just do this. Let me just call New Jersey and tell them that we need to put that on hold, and we're going to put all our energy right here. He's like, all right, 2 weeks we'll take a vote. I'm telling you, that Tuesday was my day off. We got in the car. We drove to Ocean Pines. We put a contract on the house. I mean, we were coming here if you guys elected us or not. We were coming. And the house that we currently live in is the house that we put a contract on 15 years ago. That 2 weeks, that Sunday night, Dave said, hey, would you be willing, they're going to take a vote, would you be willing to drive in? And if you get enough votes that we would call you and you'd come in. So we drove, parked at Stephen Decatur High School. My daughter was 1 year old, and she had been cooped up on a car seat, so she'd run in the grass over at Stephen Decatur, and we get the call, and they say, hey, you got the vote, come on over. We walked in that Sunday night, and we knelt at that spot right there, and people came, and they placed their hands on us, and they just anointed us as pastors of this church, and I'm telling you, before God, there's probably 3, maybe 4 really great decisions I've ever made in my life. The first one was to follow after Christ, the best decision that I could ever make. The second good decision, I made a lot of bad, but the second good decision was to marry my wife. That's a good one. The third was finally she twisted my arm and said, hey, we should have kids. I'm like, I don't want to have kids. That was a good decision. But probably the 4th best decision I've ever made is to come and be the pastor of this church. It's been the greatest joy of my life. And I look back on it, and listen, it was not easy for me, and it was, those of you who were here, it was not easy for you. That was a rough year or two where we kind of had to learn each other. But I look back and I just go, God, your favor and your fingerprints to let just a young, green, clueless guy, pastor, to come and become the lead pastor of this church. I just look back, and I cannot thank God enough, and I cannot thank you guys enough for allowing us to be a part of that journey. It's just been a great joy. So one of the first things that the elders at the time told us they need to do, they said, hey, we have this piece of property. We've raised money for it. Here's the deal, though. We don't know if that agreement for that property was with the founding pastor, Tim, or if it was with our church. Tim's gone. So you need to meet with this guy and ask him, does that deal still work? So I gave him a call. I didn't know who he was. I said, hey, I'm the new pastor of the church. Would you sit down and talk with me? And I said just that. I said, hey, our church has raised money. I heard we kind of have a verbal handshake agreement about us buying that, but we need to know, was that an agreement with our founding pastor, or was that agreement with our congregation? And he said, hey, it'd be the great privilege of our lives for you guys to build a church on our property. And we said, we want to buy it. And the church had gone through some tough times financially. We were struggling, but we had about $200,000 in the bank, and we said, we're going to buy this property. And we buy this property, and I'm telling you, those of you who were here, you remember, for years, I mean, we had spent everything we had, and there was nothing else we could do. For years, the vast majority of people in our church didn't even know where the property was. we would say, hey, we own this property, and we bought it, you bought it, and one day we're going to have a church. And nobody ever went on it. Nobody knew. It was hard to get to. Nobody knew how to get to it. And we just said, trust us. We spent your money, and we spent it wisely. But we just couldn't get there. And then around 2010, we said, we need to do something. We need to start a new capital campaign to raise some money to start developing that property and getting ways for us to get over there. And I promise you, I don't know if it was exactly like this, but this is how it felt. 2010, we stood on a Sunday morning. We asked people to make a capital campaign with us, make a pledge with us. And people sacrificially said, hey, we're going to give to this project. It was going to be about $600,000 to put piping in the ground. And that's as far as we could get. We're going to build a pond and do some piping and some stormwater management. It's going to be very expensive. And we said at the end of these 3 years, that piece of property is going to look exactly how it looks right now. We're literally going to put almost $750,000 in the ground, and that's it. We did that on a Sunday, and I'm not saying it happened this way, but this is the way it felt. That Monday, the economy collapsed. I mean, things turned upside down. You remember we went through just the recession there, and all of a sudden we had 10, 12, 15 people in our church unemployed. People were going to lose their house, and we were like, how in the world? That 3-year campaign turned into a 5-year campaign, and we were just plugging away. But we felt like God had told us that we needed to get from here to there. So we started another campaign, and this one was going to hire a builder and bring electricity and start, getting a septic and all that stuff. And here's what happened. When we started our building project, our church was about 200 people. We were in 2 services. So when we said we were going to design a building, we designed a building for 200 people. And then our church grew. So we said, okay, we're going to have to build it bigger. So during this time, what happens? Things get more expensive. So now our building is getting bigger, our expenses are getting bigger, and the project gets larger and larger and larger. Next thing you know, we went from a 15,000 square foot building to an 18,000 square foot building to a 20,000 square foot building. What started out as a $2 million project, that was a $2.5 million project, and now we're putting bids out for this new building, and we had no idea where it was going to land. It was one of these things, I would say, how much is the building going to cost? And we said, we don't know until we design it. So I was just dreading it. So it was in about 2017 that we finally got the bids back for this new building that we're going to build. This $2 million that turned into $2.5 million, 15,000 square foot building that turned into 20,000 square foot building. So we go to a meeting. They have these envelopes, these bids, and they rip open the envelopes and they start reading them. And the first bid is $5 million, $5.2 million, $5.5 million. And I'm devastated. I'm like, we can't build this. We've been raising money for years. We've been sacrificing. People have been giving. And it was one of the lowest points in the history of this church. I remember I went home and I told my wife, I said, we're done. The dream is done. There's no way. First of all, we can't afford $5.5 million. A bank will never loan us $5.5 million. And I'm going to have to go back to that church and I'm going to have to confess to them that we have wasted time and money and we're stuck in the mud. We can't go anywhere. And I honestly felt, I said, Bethany's my wife, I said, all equity in these people, they will never trust me again. I said, we're done. I said, someone else is going to have to come along and clean this up and figure this out. And I'm honestly thinking we're going to have to do something else with our lives. I said, I don't know if I could even pastor. I don't know if I could do this to another congregation. And we went and we stood in an annual business meeting. This was 2017. Many of you were there. And I just said, guys, I'm sorry, but we have blown it. And we are in trouble. And I don't know how to fix this. And the people who were in that meeting, they rallied behind me and the leadership of this team, and they said, hey, we're going to fix this thing. We're going to make this thing work. We believe that God's not done, and it's going to happen. And we went back and we engineered this building, and we went from 5.2 to 3.2, and now 90 days from now, we're going to be over there. And just blown away. For me, I look back on just the kindness of this congregation of just kind of working through that season with me. And it's something that I will never, ever, ever forget. Just the compassion and the grace that this church gave to me when I felt like we had lack of a better term, I've just felt we screwed it up royally. I felt like we had messed that thing up so much. And on November 19th, 2017, we broke ground. And man, I walk over. Last night, my daughter is 16, and she's trying to get her driver's license. And I'd forgot some stuff at church. So it was about 10 o'clock at night. And I said, hey, let's go for a drive, because she's learned how to drive. And so we go out and we drive. And I said, I'd heard that the lights on the building now they're on a timer. The lights turn on. There's spotlight on. And I had never seen it at night. So about 10:30 last night, I said, hey, let's drive over to the property and see this thing. Man, I drive up on that property, and I see what God is doing there. And I'm just blown away. I know I've taken a lot of time, so let me try to lay on this plane together. Two passages of scripture that come to mind when I think about this. The first one is in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. This is the Apostle Paul, and he's speaking of just kind of this partnership between leadership, and he says, I planted the seeds, and Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. When I think about the role that Tim Dukes has played, and other associates, and myself, and the great team of pastors and elders that we have, listen, I know this better than anybody in this room. I just know this, that any progress or success that this church has experienced is all because of the favor of God. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've laid in bed and just thought, man, I'm just over my head in this. This isn't what I went to school for. This isn't what I know. The amount of times where I said, this mountain is too big and I don't have the answer. And God has just shown up and shown up. And that's what Paul says. He says, so neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. And the reason that our church is successful and the reason our church is moving forward is all 100% because of the faithfulness of God. He gets all the praise and all the glory and all the honor for where we're heading. I know this has nothing to do with this guy. I know it because, man, I could barely balance my checkbook, much less, run a $4.5 million project. And what God has done is just awesome. And then I think of Hebrews chapter 12. Here Paul talks about, he says, therefore, we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. I think about the people who've gone before us. I think of people like Tim Dukes, but I also think of people like Arthur Meyer, people like Dave Douglas, people who've given willingly, people who sacrificed before us, that we would be able to reap the benefits of that. I think about the history of this church and just the really neat place that we have, that we're able to, one, reap the benefits of those who've gone before us and sacrificed before us, but also now that we have the opportunity to build upon the foundation of what they've done. That we are able now to take what was set before us, and now as we move forward, that we too can sacrifice for future generations. That our kids and our grandkids and those who are lost and those in our community who are yet to know God, that they'll be able to experience God and we'll be able to be a part of that. See, the great tragedy of this experience is if we get over there and we just reap the benefits of those who've gone before us. I think the great opportunity for us is that we get over there and now we have a chance to sacrifice and to plant seeds for future generations. That's what God has for us. That one day we'll get to the end of this journey and we'll be able to say, we were part of something. That maybe 10, 15 years from now that we'll be the ones who get to stand and that people will go, you know what, the reason we're able to do what we're doing today is because the folks did what they were doing back in 2018. That's my prayer. And that one day we'll stand before God and he'll look at us as individuals and he'll look at us as a church and he'll say, well done, mission accomplished. You guys did what I called you to do in Berlin and the Ocean City region.